Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome into beautiful Filene instead of being outside in the rain. It's good to be inside. My name is Ken Yalowitz. I'm the director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding, and I'm delighted to welcome you to what is a very special lecture series for us every year at the Dickey Center. Today's program is brought to you through the generosity of the class of 1950, Dartmouth class of 1950. And they were very generous in donating funds to establish the class of 1950 Senior Foreign Affairs Fellowship. And I know at least one member of the class of 1950, Joe Medlicott, is in the audience. Jack Harned was going to come, but he is ill, and I'm told his wife, Jill, is here. But if they are here, and if there are any other members of the class of 1950, I would love to have them stand and be recognized. Is Joe here? I don't see him. No. Well, let's have a good hand anyway for the class of 1950. Now, just a bit about the class of 1950 and why, in particular, they did this. The class of 1950 were the first to benefit from 4 full years under President John Sloan Dickey's enterprise, his major goal while at Dartmouth, to better prepare future generations of Dartmouth students for global leadership. And it's not simply the matter of better understanding global issues today, but also the commitment to do something about them. And that really is the legacy of John Sloan Dickey. And at their 50th reunion in the spring of the year 2000, the class presented, as I said, a generous gift to the Dickey Center for the purpose, and I quote, to bring distinguished foreign leaders, scholars, and specialists to the Dartmouth campus for short periods to interface with the students on the important issues of the day. And I would just mention that this gift is sufficiently generous that we're able to have the individual speaker spend usually a full week on the campus. And we're delighted that Patrice de Beer is with us for a whole week. It's a delight to have him, as you will soon see. And during his time here, he will be meeting with classes. We had a very lovely lunch today with students who are members of our War and Peace student group, and he'll be meeting with other student groups. He'll be doing interviews with various student newspapers and publications. So we really take advantage, of his time here. And again, our great appreciation to the class of 1950. Now, to introduce our speaker formally today, I'd like to call upon Professor Virginia Swain from the French department, professor in the French department. Ginny, she's written a great deal and done a great deal. Her PhD is from Yale. Her undergraduate work done at Middlebury College. But for me, the most important credential is that she's the reason that Patrice de Beer is here today. She is the one that made the contact with him for us, and we are very, very grateful for that. So for all your academic achievements, wonderful, but even more for bringing Patrice. And over to you, Virginia.
Well, I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to introduce Patrice de Beer today. I've had the pleasure of knowing Patrice since the winter of 2000, when in his capacity as the Washington correspondent for the French newspaper Le Monde, he came to Hanover to cover the Democratic presidential debates that were being televised from the Hopkins Center. Learning that he was in town, I invited him to dinner at my home, and without ever having met me, he accepted. Now, I had a pretty good idea of who I was dealing with, right? But I think it speaks to Patrice's sense of adventure and curiosity, not to say courage, I think, that he drove out into the wilds of New Hampshire without any inkling of what he might be getting into. These are surely the same traits that have undergirded his long and successful career as an international journalist with one of the great papers of the world. Patrice de Baer's background is in law and Oriental languages and civilizations. He graduated from the Paris Faculty of Law, the École de Droit, and the School of Oriental Studies with a specialization in Chinese and Malay Indonesian. From 1968 to 1969, he began his working life as the cultural and press attaché at the French Embassy in Malaysia, and then did a short stint as a journalist for Radio France Internationale. In 1970, he joined the foreign desk of Le Monde, where he had a highly visible career, which spanned 35 years and took him many times around the world. For his first assignment with Le Monde, he was given 2 days' notice before being sent to Ethiopia, where he had no connections and for which he was completely unprepared. Obviously, he rose to the challenge, and of the 4 new hires at the paper that year, he was one of 2 to survive. Following that first gig, Mr. de Baer was sent on assignments to Moscow and the Middle East, as well as to most of the Asian and Pacific countries. He became a correspondent in Southeast Asia in the 1970s, based first in Bangkok, and in the 1980s in Beijing. He was then named Deputy Foreign Editor and Asia Pacific Editor and served in that capacity until 1994, when he became the correspondent for Le Monde in London. His last posting was in Washington, D.C., which I believe is the ultimate assignment for an international journalist. Most recently, Patrice de Baer was editor-in-chief and editorial writer at the paper from 2001 until his retirement in 2005. During those last 4 years, he represented Le Monde at several international seminars, such as those sponsored by the 21st Century Trust, and participated in a historic video conference with Chen Shui-bian, the president of Taiwan, involving members of the European Parliament, leading journalists from across Europe, scholars, and analysts. Since his retirement in 2005, Patrice de Baer has hardly been taking it easy. He has served as a member of the selection panel for the École Nationale d'Administration, l'ENA, the famous postgraduate institution which produces the vast majority of France's political leaders. So we may have him to blame or thank for whoever becomes the Président de la République Française in 15 or 20 years. He has been on the organizing committee of a fascinating geography festival in the Alsatian town of Saint-Dié, which draws tens of thousands of visitors every year. And he has become the Paris correspondent for the London-based online newspaper OpenDemocracy.net. As he did throughout his career with Le Monde, he writes on political, diplomatic, military, economic, and cultural issues. Some of the topics he has recently covered include the latest political crisis in Hungary, the role of the French president and the French military in this summer's war in Lebanon, the hardline rhetoric of Nicolas Sarkozy and the extraordinary success of Ségolène Royal, the 2 most likely candidates for president in the upcoming French elections, and the question of Zinedine Zidane's inexplicable headbutt, which caused Les Bleus, the French soccer team, to lose the World Cup championships in July. In the process, Mr. de Baer revealed himself to be a fan of rugby rather than soccer, which I thought confirmed his courage, but he tells me that there are just as many rugby fans in France as soccer fans, nonetheless. I also understand that we should watch for a forthcoming article about the new French film Indigène, which I believe is going to be translated in English as Their Brightest Days, which deals with the children of the North African soldiers who fought for France's liberation from the Nazis in the Second World War. Patrice has also authored articles for other English-speaking newspapers and magazines, the International Herald Tribune, the Far Eastern Economic Review, The Guardian, the Daily Express, and so on. And he has appeared on the BBC, on PBS, CNN, and other high-profile television networks. He has written several books on China, the latest of which is La Chine à la mort de Deng Xiaoping, published by Le Monde Marabout in 1995 and 1997. And I gather that there may be another book in the works, perhaps focusing on the Middle East rather than the Far East this time. This afternoon, Mr. de Baer will speak on Europe and France today, 1 year after the failed referendum on the European Constitution. Please join me in welcoming my friend Patrice Debert.
Well, thank you so much, Virginia, for these excessively kind words. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very glad to find myself once again in Hanover, thanks to Ambassador Yalovitz and the Dickey Center. And I also mean all those who helped make this visit a success. I've already been here a couple of times during the 2000 primaries, following first Senator Bradley and then the then governor of Texas. You see who I mean. But the weather is much better these days than it was at that time. Anyway, we are here today to discuss the place and the role of France in Europe, or in more accurate words, the sometimes difficult relations between Europe and France, which also means the interaction between French domestic politics and the French vision of Europe and the malaise it could help to diagnose within the French society. But also the international impact of the rejection 1.5 years ago by France, but also by the Netherlands, of the European Constitutional Treaty. This issue provides, I believe, an eye-opener to the hearts and minds of the French today. Of course, this is also an important issue per se, because France was a founding country of the Common Market half a century ago in 1957, and because she remains a crucial partner of this historical endeavor. Even if the European integration process now seems blocked, or at least in disarray, just like the long-time nurtured European dream. While Asia is now playing an ever-increasing role in the strategic thinking in the US, relations between Europe and the USA remain crucial in those troubled times, thus the interest of Europe. Just a few figures quoted by Washington's Center for Strategic and International Studies that belittle those of trans-Pacific trade. The $2 trillion European and US companies derive from their US and European subsidiaries, or the nearly 60% of US foreign corporate assets located in Europe, while European companies provide nearly 75% of all foreign investments in the US. On both accounts, France is, with the UK and Germany, a major partner of yours, both as a source and as a haven for investments. As you have probably noticed from my accent, I'm French. With a Dutch-sounding name, as my family originated from Belgium. On my mother's side, my grandfather came from Hungary. He was Hungarian from Transylvania. Drafted in the Foreign Legion at the beginning of World War I, he was killed by the Turks. Other members of my family went up in smoke, murdered by the Nazis during World War II. My wife is of Chinese descent, and both our sons worked a while in the States. But all things considered, I see myself as a true Frenchman as well as a true European, by nature, but also by choice. As a journalist, I have never been thrilled by propaganda, even Europropaganda. Not only because I trust my own government no more than I trust the others, but mostly because the present and most of the previous French governments have not made the efforts to defend European ideas and ideals among their voters, despite their public professions of European faith. The efforts made by French politicians who tried to convince public opinion to vote oui in the May 29, 2005 referendum on the European Constitution did lack, to say the least, enthusiasm and power of conviction. They were, in fact, far less aggressive and effective than the non-propaganda. We saw the results, 55% against Europe, 45% for. This is partly because in France, but is it only in France, an unsavory phenomenon has bloomed in recent years. Whatever is or has gone wrong, internationally or domestically, politically, economically, socially, in the fields of culture or else, or in our own plates and glasses, it matters for the French, as you know. All that has traditionally been added on Brussels' negative balance sheet. And few European governments, starting with the French, but we, as usual, and as you have probably already noticed, feel proud to never do things the same way as others, for the better or for the worse. So few governments have had the courage to admit that decisions drafted in Brussels resulted from a consensus achieved within the European Council of Ministers, which represents all member states, or from decisions taken by the Commission, equally made of commissioners representing all members of the EU. This is a classical way of passing the bucket, of putting the blame on this so-called remote, faceless Brussels bureaucracy. A very easy bogeyman indeed, even if Brussels' aloofness towards European people's aspirations is also very much to blame. In fact, what made a convinced European out of a skeptic or unconcerned observer, and what brings me here today, were the years I spent in London in the mid-90s for Le Monde. There, listening to the wailing sirens of Little England's Eurosceptics, and God knows they were and still are many, sharing views with other colleagues from the continent, as they say in London when they talk about Europe, I came to realize that we were much closer to each other than I ever imagined, French, Swedes, Germans, Spaniards, Italians. Of course, things changed a bit when Tony Blair said he wanted Europe at the heart of Europe, but did he really have the will to go all the way? Anyway, this Euro feeling was strengthened during my 3 years in Washington, D.C., where I realized that in the world of today, which doesn't revolve anymore around Europe, the Mediterranean, or transatlantic relations, there were major new partners that have emerged: Brazil, China, India, Japan. And that the European country's isolated voice was not loud enough to be heard, not powerful enough to be listened to. Whatever we may think about our glorious historical past, Europe has to be one or run the risk of being sidestepped. Now I'll start with a brief historical introduction to Europe before trying to analyze what went wrong from the French as well as from Brussels' side. To make things short, since the end of World War II and the start of the Cold War, France played a leading role in the shaping of a new Europe. First, through its political visionaries, the fathers of Europe, assuming that in order to make impossible the emergence in the future of New World cataclysm created by Franco-German rivalries, 3 wars in 75 years, ending in world conflicts, millions of deaths, new links had to be built between these two nations within a new Europe. And as politics and defense were two burning issues at the time, it had to start from the bottom, from economic issues, first with cooperation on coal and steel, then leading to the emergence in 1957 of the common market of 6 countries. With the entry of the UK in the 70s, the single market in 93, the euro 10 years later, plus several enlargements from 6 to 9, then 12, 15, and 2 years ago, 25, 27 next year with Romania and Bulgaria, then 30, maybe 35, including or not Turkey, who knows. The European Union is now a world economic power with some political reality too. France played a key role in these developments, putting her imprint on a common European identity she influenced right from the start, especially through what has been called the Franco-German axis, which worked fairly well for a decade but is now limping. Moreover, the economic and social crisis which persists in founding countries like France, Germany, or Italy began to shake what had long looked like a well-entrenched French Euro enthusiasm. There was a first warning in 1993 with the ratification by a whisker of the Maastricht Treaty, which gave birth to the European Union. Unfortunately, the lesson wasn't learned. But are ever lessons learned? Since then, things have not improved. Public opinion has become more and more wary of a European ideal which appears more and more blurred. Gone are the days when this ideal meant saying goodbye to war and hello to prosperity and shared responsibilities. Goals are now technocratic, spelled out with a bureaucratic jargon, unable to stir enthusiasm. Europe appears at times gearless, goalless, and even unable to define her own borders. So, the French began to feel wary of policies they saw as too remote from their daily preoccupation. of a Euro speech which was so bureaucratic that it was disconnected from their real lives. But they also became wary of the double talk used by their own government, saying one thing in Brussels and another in Paris. Why should they have given more importance to Europe when their own governments were not able or willing to spell out clearly their European commitments? They also took for granted what had been so hard to build, starting with the peace Western Europe had never known before, but including also massive economic and social developments, unknown prosperity and free movement of persons, goods and ideas. And they began to blame whatever could go wrong on these so-called alien, faceless and faraway institutions in Brussels. It ended with the catastrophic result of last year's referendum and the French crisis of confidence, but not only ours, towards European goals and institutions. Most of France's trade is done within the Union, and she remains the first but not the only beneficiary of the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. Europe has been during a long time a fantastic tool for French diplomacy and influence in the world. France has been able to block policies she didn't like, for instance, the dismantlement of the CAP requested by the UK, or the Bolkestein Directive from the name of a former Dutch commissioner, which advocated total liberalization of services within the Union. She also has been able to push her views on major issues she cared for. But France's influence, paramount in a Europe of 6, crucial among the 15, has been much diluted within a Europe of 25 members and soon 27. So what went wrong? Who is to blame? What is or what are the reasons for this French Euro blues, this disenchantment, this slow parting between the new Europe and one of its founders? Are the French to blame, and why? Why have they changed so much in the last years? Is there European responsibility? Does it come from Brussels? Or should we talk of a shared responsibility? I might have some views myself, but I'm not here to impose them upon you. After all, if the French and the Americans have something in common, if you don't mind my boldness in saying so, it is in our assertiveness in believing the world revolves around us. In expressing our own point of views, as well as our feelings that if we ever are misunderstood, it can only be because the others don't understand us well, or haven't made enough efforts to do so. It is certainly not because of us. A behavior which is even more difficult to bear coming from a medium-sized power like my country. On May 9th this year, Europe Day in the EU, the only visible sign of this event in Paris was an Eiffel Tower colored in blue and yellow, the colors of Europe. No commemorative speech, no public demonstrations, hardly a line in the papers, just like if nothing had happened. These days, hardly any French politician cares or dares saying a word about Europe, as if it were a dirty word. There will be many dirty words in this speech, I apologize. If it were a dirty word, or a time bomb which could blow up his career, a word which could chase away the voters. Such is the state of the European question in France that it is often expediently swept under the carpet. And it will be probably during the duration of the election campaign for the presidency, which is due in May 2007. This is also an example of how fast the image of Europe has eroded in France. According to a Eurobarometer poll taken in 2004, 80% of Europeans and 85% of French citizens polled were then in favor of the European Constitution. Yet 1 year later, their number had been slashed almost to 45% of the French population. Staggering. And despite the fact that most political parties and almost all members of parliament, left and right, supported that text. Or maybe it is because of that. So, why were they unable, as the EU was to calm voters' fears, whatever they were? Why did France divide herself in two opposite camps, the optimists and the successful who voted oui, and all the others, the disillusioned, the disenfranchised, who said no? Why were the government and the opposition jointly unable to go all the way in favor of that text? Why did they fail? And why also did we, the media and the pundits, fail to grasp the feeling of our own neighbors? Why did so many people say that they were for Europe, but not for the Europe they had been offered, too ultra-liberal, they said, and therefore voted a resounding no. Finally, why were the naysayers so successful in convincing, often with worn-out, old-fashioned slogans playing on people's feelings for a more secure environment, on nationalism, or even on plain lies? What they did only was to play on fears or on public opinion's opposition to the entry of Turkey in the Union, and it worked. We'll see that a little bit later. But they also played traditional French sport, shooting at the messenger. We know fairly well the risk there is in consulting the French by referendums, which usually turn into plebiscites. The French usually vote more on the messenger, this time President Chirac and his government, than on the message. They voted against the text more because it had been put to vote by a government they didn't trust than because of the text itself. A text so long, a boring monument of paper of 14,740 words in French, written in a technocratic jargon few people bothered reading, but a text which, only a few months earlier, had had the support of 85% of voters. How many people have I heard saying that the only way to punish our leaders, to protest against tax hikes, to demand wage increases, to grumble against poor train services, high price of fresh vegetables or of gasoline, or just to express their dissatisfaction was simply to reject Chirac's constitution? Even worse, how many people did vote against that document, not because they disliked it, but only because they felt they hadn't been given any other option to express their grievances against the way they perceived Europe was or was not working? Two crucial factors have driven France to that situation, two factors which are, in a way, intermingled. One is the political elite's loss of credibility. The other is their inability to conduct a clear, long-term, workable, and convincing European strategy, to explain it to their fellow countrymen without resorting to the double talk I mentioned earlier, and to assuage their fears of a world situation, of a globalization, which the French feel threatening for their jobs, their lives, and their future. Neither bothering nor having the courage to stress how much the opening of world markets has benefited France. The figures are there. And of looking at ways to counter its negative, socially destructive side effects. First of all, the loss of credibility. It is banal to say that today, all over the world, the time of great men, of great people, of respected public figures has gone, and that we are living in the era of little ordinary men or women, whose achievements are too often hyped by the media. Could you, for instance, give me the name of a great figure in power today? The only name that comes to my mind would be Nelson Mandela, but he has retired. In France, where since 1978, every government has been defeated at the end of its first term, where so many promises have been made and not kept. We now have a saying, quoted from a former Gaullist ministers: promises only bind those who listen to them. Where we have seen scandal after scandal revealed, but politicians hardly ever punished. Where politicians come but never go, glued to power for decades in the government as well as in the opposition, the word politician has also become a dirty word. A survey quoted some months ago by socialist presidential candidate Ségolène Royal, who might be the first woman ever with a chance of winning the presidency, pointed out that only 1% of people polled trusted politicians. Yes, 1%. How can you get lower in people's esteem? This explains why extremist parties, from the far right with the openly racist National Front to the far left with one Communist Party, 3 Trotskyite parties, and splinters of Green, did represent more votes than the two main parties during last presidential elections in 2002. There is a French attraction to extremism, which is an exception in Europe, since these extremist parties, have no chance or not even the desire to achieve power. They only represent a protest vote from voters who have lost trust in the present elite. On the government side, after almost 12 years in power, Chirac's legacy appears far from glorious. Despite his opposition to the war in Iraq, which seems justified if we look at the situation there today. And despite his position on last summer's war in Lebanon, one can wonder what this legacy can be. Political immobilism, chronism, financial scandals, lack of long-term policies and of vision, all this has tainted not only his image, but also the image of politics. Open political rivalries prevail within his own government and the UMP party he founded, and the main right-wing candidate for the presidency is now his arch-enemy, Nicolas Sarkozy, his home minister, who recently flew to Washington, D.C. to get his picture taken next to President Bush, and who is campaigning on the slogan of a break. A break from what, if not from Chirac's times? On Europe, Chirac has played on the social chord, has promised social protection and the continuance of public services à la française, which, as you should know, are no longer sustainable, while at the same time letting Brussels pass liberal directives which, in fact, contradicted his own official positions. Double talk once again. Another example is Turkey, whose entry in the EU remains a burning issue. Hardly explained by governments, despite prevailing cultural or political fears, this issue exploded in our faces in the last 2 years as negotiations were about to begin about Ankara's accession to the EU. Only then people begin to realize that they might, one day, have a common border with Iraq or Iran. Chirac, who was in favor of Turkey, had to bend to public opinion and promise a referendum on the issue. On the left, the Socialist Party is divided as its leaders are primarily concerned with promoting their own candidacy at the presidency. They split on the referendum on Europe last year, as former Prime Minister Laurent Fabius campaigned for a no vote against his own party leadership and against all other socialist parties in Europe and almost all trade unions. Using almost the same jargon as the far left, Fabius, who used to represent the most moderate right wing of socialism, accused the Constitution of being the Trojan horse of US-style ultraliberalism and globalization. These internal rivalries, which irritate public opinion more and more, have superseded the European question, adding an extra nail to the coffin of our European common dream. If you don't trust what politicians do and say in their own country more than the so-called faceless bureaucrats in Brussels, if you think they lack courage and vision, if you think they use major political issues for their own petty ambitions, why should you trust them more on Europe? And if they can't answer your questions, calm your fears, why should you look toward a distant Europe, which your own politicians systematically blame for their own failures? Today, the French feel more and more isolated, remote from politics and politicians. There is no majority of this crisis generation, as it has been called by the French leftist daily Libération, to think that there are no more clear differences between right and left, and who feel partyless, just like people could be stateless or homeless. This is not the usual type of crisis any country can face from time to time. This time, this crisis is much deeper. It is an existentialist crisis, a crisis of identity, which will probably be hard and long to overcome in an ever-changing world where all countries like ours have to find a new place for themselves. How could you, in those circumstances, expect the French voters to come back from their votes and adopt a more positive attitude towards Europe? They haven't. On the opposite, polls show that people are even more disappointed as they feel their votes have not changed anything. In times of economic and social uncertainties, with unemployment at around 9%, with outsourcing destroying or displacing jobs by the thousands, and putting more pressure on job security and income level, when for the first time for decades, people fear that their children's lives might be worse than theirs, when they have lost faith in the future, as many people have, why should they believe that Europe could protect them better than their own country, a place where, at least, they feel at home and more secure? This frame of mind, even if it is counterproductive, is here in Europe, but maybe more prevalent in France. It explains, in a way, this feeling of fear, of wariness towards change, this new navel-gazing, inward-looking attitude, noticed, for instance, in France or in Germany, this fear of the future, of the world surrounding us is, I believe, strongly linked to this lack of leadership by politicians who, because of their lack of results, are seen as talk people rather than do people, people who talk about what should be done, but don't always put their money where their mouth is. Add to that the pervasive feeling of gloom that our fate is not anymore in our own hands, nurtured by a new school of thought known in France as declinism. Scholars, analysts, journalists who repeat like a mantra that France is on the path of a maybe terminal decline. And you know how we French love these endless intellectual debates, even if they are sometimes based more on wild, preconceived ideas than on hard facts. To these irrational fears, former French Socialist Prime Minister Michel Rocard answered some months ago that isolationism in a national cocoon might look comfortable, but that it was not a solution. That the solution lies with Europe, a Europe which united could change and actually improve the regulation of capitalism. France is now too small to do it her way as a single country. She is unable to convince the rest of the world to stop the clock, just to let her do it. The only alternative is Europe. Trying, as the present government did, to tackle the scourge of job insecurity only at home, Rocard says, is an illusion. He doesn't see any more solutions on the national level, only global ones. Saving Europe, our jobs, and our social cohesion are intrinsically linked, a one and single struggle, he said. But his efforts to break long-standing taboos have remained so far unsuccessful. This explains probably why so many pundits all over the world have commented on France's conservatism and on her inability or unwillingness to reform and face unavoidable changes other countries are already facing. There's some truth in that when you see how many French students dream of joining the bureaucracy for the sake of a job for life, rather than a less secure but more challenging and often better paid job in the private sector. Yet this approach needs to be qualified. When you don't trust those who lead or aspire to lead your country, it will answer your grievances in acts and not in words. When you have stopped believing in their promises, when you see that ever-widening gap between the realities you live in and the world politicians tell you about, when you struggle to fill up your dinner plate while major companies pile up huge profits, it is hard to believe in your own and in your country's future. How can you be ready to accept to sacrifice part of a comprehensive social safety net it took a century to have struggled to build, if you are not even sure it will change anything for the better? When you feel, as the French saying goes, that plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, the more it changes, the more it remains the same. Yet, but a lot of evidence show that the French are not ready, not to say enthusiastic, to accept changes, and that they hope to be able to muddle through as long as they can, looking into the rearview mirror. You can't entirely blame them. But nothing is ever simple. They also realize that these very changes they fear are unavoidable, provided, of course, they could trust those who advocate them. Last May, there was an interesting survey published which went against the prevailing tide, showing that 93% of people polled believed that in-depth reforms were urgently needed of labor regulations, education, or legal system. We have seen that one of the reasons why so many French voted no to Europe was that they wanted to express their opposition to the opening of negotiations with Turkey to join the Union, even if they had been told these negotiations could last 10 years or more. But many also saw their vote as a way to show their displeasure at the latest widening of the EU to 10 new members, an enlargement on which they hadn't been really consulted. That France was, at this time, the most skeptical country about enlargement was certainly not a surprise. Yet a candid and well-prepared democratic and communication process might have carried the day and have given a more democratic image of the way the European Union works. A lost occasion for which Europe has paid a heavy price, but maybe also a lesson to be learned for the future. So Europe has failed at several levels: communications, public relations, to sell her message to 25 different public opinions, to make her message evolve with the time, rather than rehashing the old, worn-out message which, decades ago, had made Europe so popular. a message which has lost its power of conviction. Besides, we are still waiting to hear convincing messages for tomorrow, messages which have to be crafted by elected politicians, not by irresponsible bureaucrats. This is the time for politicians to make hard decisions and to take risks. Even if, as Luxembourg Prime Minister frankly admitted recently, he said, we very much know which are the right policies needed to solve the crisis Europe is facing. But we have not yet been able to find a way to be re-elected once we have implemented them. So Brussels has to do away with self-righteousness, with the arrogance of those who think they are right. They have the difficult task of tailoring their policies to different opinions or to counterbalance each member state's own version of events. One could say that if we Europeans share the same bed, we still have different dreams. This also helps to explain how the EU enlargement policy went wrong and how its negative impact spread so rapidly in France, but not only in France. How a strategic and generous move to welcome former members of the Soviet bloc within the EU, which should have been perceived in a very positive way 15 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and helping these countries to join the market economy could have blurred the European ideal and have such a disrupting effect among all members. Debates on this last enlargement were reduced to minimum by members state and by Brussels, which I call widening by stealth. And it was not sold with the same packaging in different countries. For instance, it was sold to the Baltic states as a way for the EU to get closer to the USA, which was the message I wanted to hear, while we were told, when we were told something, that a wider EU would stand stronger in the world. Remember, it was the time when your administration was trying to involve Europe in her war in Iraq. At the same time, people felt they had not been asked the right questions, that they deserved explanations on some basic existential questions, like what are the final aims of the European Union, or which new members should join it and when? Where should Europe end? Should the EU include all European countries just because they are fully or partly located in Europe? Should it include Turkey, some or all of the Caucasus states, Russia? Should it encompass all members of the Council of Europe and extend its borders to China? Is the EU a geographical, political, economic, cultural, or religious concept? Does Europe have geographical borders which historically stopped at the Bosphorus, or political ones, and which ones? And who is going to clarify that? As you can see, these are not minor questions, even if they have often been portrayed in a somehow ethnic or Judeo-Christian way when it comes to Muslim Turkey. When Europe's institutions drafted for 6 countries are not able to manage well an EU of 15, blocking the decision-making process, nurturing frustration at all levels, making major decisions unachievable, blurring the voice of Europe in the international area, then how could its widening be to a big country like Turkey, but also to troubled areas like the Balkans, take the priority over institutional reforms? How could widening supersede deepening? How could we add the burden of new problems while being unable to solve the present ones? How could we welcome Turkey before having a new home rules? To be provocative, I would say that the question is less whether Turkey, for instance, is ready to join the EU than whether the EU is ready to integrate such a new member. Of course, things are not easy, views are different, and sometimes contradictory, and problems complex. Different countries see things differently in Europe. For instance, the Poles look more towards the US and want to protect themselves against their Russian neighbor and traditional enemy, which Paris, London, or Berlin, eager for Russian oil and gas supply, are openly courting. All this makes a common energy policy problematic. The French and the German are too engaged in self-destructing navel-gazing. Bureaucrats are too remote from the people. Politicians are too self-centered. Journalists are too eager to look for anything that's odd, new, or inaccurate. Academics are too slow to react. Businessmen are too much obsessed by their balance sheets, and each social or ethnic group is too close to their own interests. Yet it is this heterogeneous coalition that has driven, is driving, and will drive Europe to the future. Thus, the necessity to prioritize its deepening politically through a fundamental law, whatever its name, and the word constitution now sounds bad with the French or the Dutch, to smoothen and rationalize management of an entity of 457 million people, 50% more than the US. Of course, politicians know they can't force it on to their voters. They know they will have to wait for the next presidential elections or till the next Euro election in 2009, and that they better present a packaging which would be acceptable to all, but at the same time, a packaging that would be able to work. Only time will tell if the proposals that have been made by the chairman of the European Commission of a Europe of projects, of a Europe of results, will help restart the EU and reconcile the French with Europe. But institutional reforms can't do the trick alone. French voters don't give much importance to legal changes. They want results where it hurts, on social and economic issues. They want, first of all, jobs and protection from the side effects of globalization, which they know under the name of mondialization. And they blame Europe's inability to cope with these issues. Most of all, the French want a more protective Europe. Paradoxically, many French, but also Dutch, saw the last enlargement not as a source of stability within a continent at least reunified and regulated as it was meant to be, but instead as an added factor of instability. Insecurity, they thought that the new enlargement to former Eastern European countries was not enough to counterbalance their feelings of insecurity. Insecurity because of their fear of immigration. France and Netherlands and maybe Spain are the key countries on that burning and divisive issue. And because of their feelings that globalization can also have dire consequences on them. As a Dutch sociologist put it, they feel that Europe must not only be a space for economic liberalization, but also for protection, which for the French means first safeguarding their traditional social safety net, combined with maintaining their country's network of public services, which they fear the liberals, another dirty word in French, in Brussels or London wants to dismantle or privatize. After having accepted in the last 15 years drastic economic and social reforms of pensions, national health, or unemployment benefits, which the French were told would solve forever all their problems, they were told a few years later that it was not enough and that new efforts were required. So they have come to consider the word reform as just another of a long series of dirty words. A word which for them only means more personal and apparently endless sacrifices. It might be difficult for enlightened people like us tonight to understand this feeling of rejection and despair coming from those facing the impact of globalization. The positive impacts of globalization can be felt all over the world. We know them, we feel them. But at the same time, one has to recognize that its benefits have not reached all walks of life equally, far from it, and that many people are less well off than before. Just about half of the French have doubts on the positive effects of Europe, not to talk about the euro. Most of them have the feeling that they are also the victims of globalization. This explains the impact of movements called anti-mondialisation or altermondialist, anti-globalization. An impact felt differently, but equally left, right, and center. And an impact which is often linked to an anti-American feeling. Not against your country and the American people as such, but against what the US are supposed to represent. This impact is so strong that politicians are unwilling to tackle it publicly. Sometimes they prefer to sidestep it, sometimes they even play on it. This is maybe an aspect of this other French disease called anti-Americanism. Now, to make things even more complicated, I would like to add another contradiction to this picture. People fear job outsourcing, competition from goods produced cheaply in developing countries, import of underpaid foreign labor, in which they see unfair competition. Yet, they prefer to buy Chinese-made goods or electronic goods just because they are cheaper. just forcing the closure of local enterprises and loss of jobs, including in their own neighborhoods. They tend to forget that to sell Airbuses to India or China, we have to import consumer goods from there. These contradictions are plenty, but feelings are so high that it is hard to explain calmly all these intricacies of world politics. I guess it mustn't be very different here. It has taken time and a failed referendum for Europe to realize the depths of these feelings. It will probably take even more to tackle them if it can be done. But for the French, the success or failure of the European ideal lies there. They do not care anymore about the lofty ideals of eternal peace. They have it, at least in Western Europe, of a single market, of common institutions, of widening, deepening, enlargement, whatever you call it. What they want now is to feel the positive impact of Europe in their daily lives. More protection, less intrusion. Often without realizing that in the globalized world of today, these achievements can only be reached jointly by a united Europe, which would carry a heavier weight in the international arena, that a single country, even ours, won't carry the same weight to be listened to the same way, and that a single voice is better heard than a choir of 25 different voices, however musical they might sound. All this comes back to the crisis of identity I mentioned earlier, at national as well as at European level. Who are we now? What do we represent? What about our cultural and historical backgrounds? Are they an asset? Are they a liability? Are they a combination of both? Is our economic system performing well enough? Is our educational system churning out good enough generations for the future? Can we pay for a social safety net, or should we, as we do now, spend money we don't have and sending the bills to our own children? These are questions you might also be asking yourselves. But also, should we look in the rearview mirror while driving forward, or just discard the rearview mirror? Should we share the driving with others, or keep the wheel, the brakes, or the accelerator firmly into our own hands and into our own control? Cling to the traditional nation-state rather to a supranational Europe. It is in these circumstances that the debate of a federated Europe or Europe of nations has returned to the front burner. In times of difficulties, it is logical that we turn towards what we know best, where we feel safer, more at home. This is why more politicians are advocating a renewal of the nation-state. I wouldn't like to end on such a pessimistic note. Recent events have given a hint that a chance might be possible. First of all, with some major European countries' involvement in the Lebanese peace process, Italy, France, Spain, Germany, Greece have sent troops to boost UNIFIL's presence along the border with Israel, which testifies that Europe can, if she wishes to, as a group of nations, take her international responsibilities. Then Europe seems to have reappeared by the side door in our presidential campaign. It was mentioned by the two main contenders, which is something quite new for quite some time. Instead of a formal conclusion, as we French like them so much, I would like to end this lecture by quoting French writer and Nobel Prize winner Paul Valéry, who gave his personal vision of the old continent in the book supplement of the April 29, 1928 New York Herald Tribune, not the International Herald Tribune. This essay, which was recently rediscovered in the Newberry Library in Chicago, was meant to help the American public to be more sensitive to us Europeans. I would like to thank Jane Blevins, who edited this essay and gave me permission to use it. Let me just quote Valéry, and you will see how up-to-date this almost 80 years old essay is. I quote, "There is in Europe a question of Europe. Nothing is more remarkable than the activity, one might almost say the anxiety, with which a number of men on this side of the ocean are considering the existence or the definition as a separate entity of this Europe, to the name of which they attach a meaning quite other than geographical. They ask, for instance, whether Europe should be opposed to Asia or America, or whether the Occident as a whole should be opposed to the Orient as a whole." Then Valéry goes on like this. "I shall illustrate by a personal example of how a European, and one whose nature was purely speculative, was insensibly led to meditate on the question of this nature. we are not dealing with today or even yesterday, for the period of which I'm speaking lies 30 years in the past. That's about a century ago. About that time, for a reason I do not know, the successive enterprises of Japan against China and of the United States against Spain made a singular impression on my mind. It was referring, as you might guess, to the Sino-Japanese War of 1895 and to the Spanish-American War of 1898. But today, he might also have referred to the emergence of China as a superpower or to the war on terror. Until that time, Valéry adds, I had never thought that Europe really existed. I regarded this name as purely geographic. It had no meaning for my sensibility. I felt myself to be French, I felt myself to be human, and I was unconscious of any intermediate sentiment. And he ends by stressing the manifest contrast in the state of Europe, which created the new order of things in the world, and which, at the same time, is subject to a terrible burden of traditions, customs, memories, and hates. This contrast has grown even more striking in recent years when the changes in the world outside of Europe have opposed to the traditional European policies a growing power which tends to organize and equip itself in the European manner. It means the United States. And the final sentence is, the destiny of our little Europe is at stake. It's a prophetic text, if we remember that World War II blew up 11 years later, and that the building of a new Europe started a quarter of a century later. Great intellectuals, great visions. This also shows, as Friday's panel discussion here on America's need to address the past will most probably show, the importance and the weight of history, of knowing one's past for nations present and future. Thank you.
I'll speak for about 5 minutes, and then
All right.
you can come back, or you
All
can
right.
stay here. Or...
Well, I'll just sit here.
It's almost dinner time, so I'll let the dinner makers have a chance to take off. I'm Ann Saada. I'm from the Department of Government, and I'd like to say just a couple of words in response to what Mr. DeBeer has said. This isn't the news hour, so I'm not going to contradict what he said. I'd actually like to put it in a somewhat different framework, because I think that what he talked about with specific reference to France is really not a French crisis. For once, the French aren't doing things their own way. It's a general democratic crisis. This is not about Europe, it's about representation. And it's not about economics, it's about politics. In the chronology that Mr. DeBeer gave us of the European idea and of the construction of the European community, there was an important omission, and it was the 1954 debate about the European defense community, which ended kind of disastrously in France as parties split down the middle and the project went down to failure. And it was after that fiasco that the pro-European elites in France decided that a project by stealth was a good idea and that doing it openly was not going to work. And indeed, the European project then did proceed openly insofar as it was an economic project, but by stealth insofar as it was a political project. And I think that worked reasonably well until what we now call globalization became not a sub-theme, but rather the major theme of our politics and of the way we organize representation and decision-making and accountability. And that happened to coincide with the, probably not by accident, but nonetheless, it coincided with the democratization of both Southern Europe, so Spain, Greece and, well, let's just say Greece on that end of Europe and Spain and Portugal at the western end of Europe. And so immediately the question of enlargement came up, and it came up in that context before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I remember at the time the debate as it was taking place as a debate in which there was no way to be right in this debate. So on the one hand, you had, to use the British actors for this, you had Mrs. Thatcher advocating widening because she wanted to subvert any chance of constructing a Europe that would be an alternative political framework for democratic decision-making and political identification. She did not want a political entity that would work. Remember, this is a woman who claimed that society didn't exist. So Mrs. Thatcher had one reason for wanting widening. Someone like Shirley Williams, the ex-Labor social democratic politician and the daughter of Vera Brittain, I believe, Shirley Williams had a different argument for enlargement, and that was we can't deny to fledgling democratic states the support that integration into Europe will offer them. It's not fair. It's not responsible. It's remaining faithful to the original mission of the European idea, to backstop people who are striving for democracy and prosperity when they most need that help. And again, those of us who are old enough in the room, if you remember, the Spanish democratization was kind of touch and go for a while. There was shooting in the parliament. So that seemed a rather compelling argument. At the same time, it was clear, at least to me, and I think to many other people, that enlargement, even that enlargement, which was already, which was not at all like the current enlargements in terms of the kinds of political, cultural, economic, historical diversity that they involved, those enlargements were going to jeopardize the emergence of an alternative to the nation state as a framework for for democratic political decision making, and I think that has that what's made this crisis so profound and so general. And the reason why electorates in all the major European countries, I mean, basically France just did for the other country, Tony Blair heaved a sigh of relief as the French said no on May 29th. So the British case was obvious, but the German case in many ways was more interesting. And if you want to see another sort of electorate that is, to put it mildly, ticked off. The German electorate is very ticked off and has produced a kind of impossible political situation, again around reform, and again around the rejection of elites that no longer seem to be offering what people no longer seem to be resonating with their electorates. So everybody recognizes that there are problems, everybody recognizes that reforms are necessary, everybody rejects the reforms because there are no organizations around that make people feel like they're included, like they're being listened to, like this is their enterprise. So I think we've got a pretty general problem. It's clear that the nation state isn't working. Mr. DeBear managed not to mention the Republican model, and I admire him because every time you do this in front of an American audience, it's a catastrophe. Then you have to go on for another hour and explain what the French Republican model is. But the Republican model has gone bust in France, just as the social market model has gone bust in Germany, and just as whatever we're going to call the British model, the happy British model of the 50s and 60s, has gone bust in Britain. And we can talk about our own model. I don't think it's doing too well either. So so nobody's got a replacement model. And that's what this European Constitution didn't offer. And so Patrice and I and everybody else, like everybody in this room, we all went out and said, vote yes. Whether we were right or left, conservative, the parliamentary, as it's called in France, the parliamentary right, the parliamentary left, the elites were united. Please, guys, vote yes. Did we have arguments? No, actually, we didn't. Because is Europe a political model? No, it's not. We simply know that the models we've got, the Republican model, the equivalent models in other countries, aren't working very well. And we have some sense that if we can't do it at the European level, we're not going to be able to do it. In part for the reasons that Rocard gave, that Patrice cited, that Europe is the context in which we can regulate capitalism, but that's not really the argument that I think is essential, and it's not the argument, I think, that people were looking for. People wanted to say, yeah, you can only regulate capitalism if there are organizations out there that are going to represent interests and kind of fight it out. That's how we make political decisions. And those organizations simply aren't there. There are no European political parties. The European Parliament doesn't function like a domestic parliament. So there's this, we're in this margin of uncertainty where people understand what they're losing, and they don't yet see people giving them a model, proposing a model that looks compelling. And I think that the dangers are clear, and I think that the drama of this was really played out in an episode subsequent to the referendum, to which Patrice did not make reference, and that was in the riots of November 2005. Those riots weren't a new event. So urban, peri-urban riots in France, these riots have been going on since at least 1980. What was new was that they were all over the country. And frankly, what was new was both the response of the government and the response of the left. So the government, to call Sarkozy a pyromaniac, I think he's the Minister of the Interior, is not too strong a term. He basically threw fuel on a fire that was already quite explosive by calling people names and by saying things that were simply not true, by describing the rioters in ways that were sociologically incorrect, but that fed other people's prejudices. So the government reacted with a kind of law and order rhetoric and law and order policies that simply fanned the flames of people who already felt, who were rioting in large part because they felt excluded. But what was more disturbing, I think, was the response on the left and the response of civil society, which was, to make it a little simpler than it was, Zippo. The left had nothing to say about what was happening, and civil society did nothing, which was different from what had happened in the early 80s when there was a response. And I think that inability of the left to think through the problems of the people who are being very basically left out, who are being excluded in every sense of the word, economically, in terms of their life chances and their options, excluded politically as well as economically. That's disturbing, and it's symptomatic of this kind of deep political crisis in which the democratic countries find themselves, and to which we need to find a solution. So that was a little longer than I meant, but I didn't explain the Republican model, so you should count yourselves lucky. So let me ask for questions for Patrice, and I'll field I'll call on people and let him answer. Yes, sir.
Just after the failure of the May 29th election, there was some commentary here in the United States that was it really necessary to have this full overarching constitution? Since the basis of this had been primarily economic, and all of the thousands of negotiations of agriculture, steel, et cetera, across borders been made. Was it necessary to have a full constitution, particularly in light of the professor's comment that there weren't the institutions to be really supporting a Europe?
Well, we in continental Europe, I wouldn't say the same with the United Kingdom. We consider that we need rules, we need written laws, we need regulations. Thus, in this present situation, we need a constitution, a home rule, or whatever, because we feel more comfortable with written laws. And we want a structure. We want a structure that works. And to have a structure that works, we need regulations. And we don't feel at ease in, let's say, the British situation, where you have no constitution, where political changes muddle through without any formal context. And this explains why most people wanted a constitution, which they voted against afterwards. But they wanted a constitution. They wanted to feel safe. They wanted to know what the ground rules were, and they wanted to know how things would be regulated. This is part and parcel of our mentality, which is not at all what is considered as quote unquote, because I know this word doesn't have much meaning, but much real meaning, but which is often used. We are not in the same Anglo-Saxon frame of mind, which you probably understood before, from what I said before.
My colleague Gene Lyons from government.
Let me go back and ask you why there was such a furor for a constitution, and why the document that was produced, because quite frankly it was an abomination. It was a 300-page document which was a compilation of statutes and not a constitution. And if you look at the history of the EU, it has progressed incrementally, step by step, small, and Delors himself, you may recall, would just take small steps, and these would not disturb interested parties. So why was this decision taken? And why did the eminent men who led this and who wrote the Constitution, how did they get into that box?
Well, first of all, institutions, or what was used as institutions, didn't work anymore. It worked well when you had 6 or 12 countries where everybody more or less knew each other. And then it went bigger and bigger and bigger. Problems grew bigger. Traditions became more and more different. Standard of living became different. And there became a time where it was necessary to have something to bind all the 25 together. It is because things were not working and hadn't been working for long. There had been trials before, they didn't work. But the problem is, it's difficult to solve a problem with 6 different countries. But the constitution was negotiated between representatives of 25 countries. Each of them wanted to put their own imprint on the text. Each of them wanting things to be absolutely included or absolutely deleted from the text. Each of them having a right of veto. So it made things very, very difficult indeed. And that's the problem which Europe will have to face until I don't know who can impose from above a constitution that everybody would love. But I think we are still very, very far from that.
Well, as a matter of fact, because of those very problems, the decision to write a constitution like that was probably a mistake.
Yes, but I feel something was needed. the 25 governments of the Union decided it had to be a constitution, so it had to be a constitution. And the way it was negotiated was probably not the best one, but a small group of law professors might have done something much better. The economists presented a project that was filling only a couple of pages, but then they didn't have to deal with 25 different governments. And maybe they should have done it another way and put a few people together, locked in a room until they came out with something. And then, just like when you elect a pope, waiting for white or gray smoke. And then, but the answers might have been, shoot all these guys and start all over again.
Sir?
I'm intrigued by Beer's observation that every French government has been defeated at the end of its first term in recent years. I'm tempted to ask you to share the secret of this. Necessarily a bad thing that you get rid of rather than later.
It's not necessarily a bad thing. I see your point. But let's say it means that no government has been able to keep the confidence of those who elected them only a few years before, which means that they didn't fulfill the promises they made. They were not able to solve problems that arose, and they were not able to satisfy their voters either with the economic situation or with the social situation or any other fields. It's a fact that the French electorate is versatile, that they don't trust anybody anymore, and that they vote for the lesser evil each time. But we vote every 5 years, and you vote every 2 years. That's also a difference. Maybe you would like to vote every 5 years, I don't know.
Actually, you vote more often than every 2 years, every 5 years.
Yes, I mean
and
for
they've all been
Congress.
biennial elections. And the lesser evil, you could make your case even more strongly, but the lesser evil wasn't what people voted for in 2002. I think you would reconsider your position if Mr. De Beer had more time to talk to you. Yeah, you had a question.
You didn't offer your personal opinions, but if I could ask you, what do you think about Turkey joining?
Well, I'm not terribly in favor of it for the moment, because, well, first of all, as I said before, we are not ready for it. And second, I don't think they are ready for it. And I don't think that we have explored all the consequences of Turkey joining the EU. I think the religious issue, which has been mentioned several times, doesn't carry much ground. I think the problem is not there. There's a huge economic and social difference which should be bridged before. And I think that rather than having delayed for about 30 years negotiations with Turkey, a better thing would have been to not for them to join, but to work together and to help them develop so that after times, after years, after decades, they would reach an economic and social level which would make it easier for them to join the EU. And then you would have to solve the other issue, which is difficult to solve. What are the borders of Europe? Is Turkey part of Europe? And I'm sure that hardly anybody in Europe wants to have a common border with Iran or Iraq and have Turkish policemen policing the border, and that anybody would get into Turkey, including Kurdish families who have half of their members in Turkey and half in Iran, Iraq, or Syria. We don't think that allowing these people through a Turkish border, I don't think we would be very comfortable if these people could move as far as Britain without any control whatsoever. I think especially in the present circumstances of terrorism and Islamism and so on, I think it would be very difficult for the general public to accept, very difficult for governments to manage, and a nightmare for security forces wherever they are. We have to take reality also into considerations, and the enlargement is not only an act of faith, it's also taking into consideration the hard and sometimes unpleasant realities. And it's difficult when you look at Turkey. They go one step forward, then one step backward, then one step forward, then two steps backwards. They have legislation problems. They have human rights problems, as we have seen with the trial of the last Nobel Prize for Literature. He was put on trial only a few months ago because he had mentioned the Armenian genocide, which the Turks say never happened. It's difficult. I can see the point of those who think Turkey should join, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm not convinced that it is possible right now. I'm only shocked that it took 30 years to start telling the Turks that we are not sure we want them. We should have told them that 30 years ago if we really felt that way. And I think this has been a failure of an institution that is unable to take hard decisions.
Yes. I was wondering when you were talking about where are the boundaries of Europe. There's the issue of Cyprus, where when you look on the map, you would say, how is this in Europe? Clearly that can be included much more easily than Turkey due to its population. It's tiny. But in terms of the geographic question, I was rather surprised that that didn't seem to come up with regard to Cyprus. Is that simply because of the Greece, kind of the political pressure from Greece, or?
Yes. So you want the official answer or the hard answer? No. Cyprus went in just because the Greeks put their veto on enlargement if Cyprus was not included. And this created a problem because Europe had already been divided when you had two Germanys, and the borders of the EU were right in the middle of Germany. So the Cyprus problem should have been solved before they joined the EU. It was not. And it is a sore point. It creates problems within the EU, it creates problems in Cyprus, and it creates problems with Turkey. And the problem with Turkey is even more severe in the sense that how can you expect Europeans to welcome Turkey with open hands when they refuse to recognize the existence of one of the members of the Union they demand to join? It's a very difficult question, but you are right. Cyprus was a problem that should have been solved before. And this is that sort of questions who make those who were in favor of the constitution say that better a poorly written constitution that gives some ground rules than no fundamental law at all.
Yes.
German press is saying that when Angela Merkel takes over as president of the EU in January, that she's going to make the constitution a big issue, and she's going to push it. Is she trying to take pressure off her domestic problems? Is she trying to prove she's a super leader? What does she gain by doing this?
Well, a leadership role. I hope she does it. I hope it works. But she will have to convince a lot of not only countries, because you can convince governments, but in countries like France or the Netherlands, you will have to have a referendum. And the failed referendum in France or in the Netherlands was the tree that hit the forest. That is to say that even if France and the Netherlands had voted yes to the European Constitution wouldn't have been adopted because the British would never have put it to vote or would have voted against it. So the question is still, as usual, what about the Brits? You know them as well as we do because you wage war against them as we did. And they are a wonderful country, but a very difficult country to manage. Excuse me? Yes? Yes? Yes?
I'm associated with a very small agricultural school in northern Greece. During the 90s, money poured in from the EU to this little small agricultural school, money in the billions. It also in the 90s poured into Portugal and Spain. Where did all this money come from? Since France has one of the largest economies in the world, certainly much of that money must have, and I meant to say Ireland too, it built Ireland into a sustaining economy. Where did that money come from? Much of it must have come from France. Therefore, isn't part of the antagonism on the part of the French towards the EU that as you let in, though, especially the eastern countries now, the poor countries, doesn't a Frenchman think, why should I give all this money to those countries?
The problem never arose that way, and there was, as far as I know, except in extremist or nationalist groups, the problem never arose, and nobody questioned all that money that was sent to Spain, Portugal, or Greece. Of course, when decision had to be taken, someone like Jacques Chirac was against Spain joining the EU because of his strong links with the agricultural lobby in France. The problem now is that if there was money available, if there was a lot of money available from France, but also from Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Scandinavia, and so on, if there was money available in the 70s, 80s, 90s, there's no more money available now. There's an economic crisis almost everywhere, and people first think about themselves, and there's no money for the present widening. New members of the EU cannot expect to get the same amount of support, even if they get a lot. It's far from being as much as Greece, Spain, Portugal, or Ireland got. And it will take much longer for them to reach the same standard of living and the same economic level that Greece, Spain, Portugal, or Ireland reached before. Situation has changed. Institutions have not.
One more question? Great, well, thank you, Mr. DeVille.
Thank you.